but we're in a series right now called Big Questions, Bigger God. And it's something that we've done before. We're kind of bringing it back. And it's just a chance for people to say, here's a question I've always wanted to ask. I've never known when or where or how to ask it, but it gives us a chance to address those true heart issues. We began the series asking the question, can a Christian lose their salvation? Like, once I'm saved, am I always saved? Or is there something I have to do to, keep checking that box? We then asked the question, okay, well, we're a Christian now. Well, can I keep sinning? Or do I have to kind of fight that sin nature? What does that look like? And today we're kind of finishing up the series within a series, asking, what even is sin? And why do we care? And I had to remind myself multiple times this week that this three-part mini-series was supposed to be 1 week. And it just kept growing. And Thursday, I'm sitting in my office saying, I could do another one. But I'm like, no, I'll save that. I can only talk about sin for so long before I feel like I just need to go re-baptize myself 50 times or something. But we'll continue next week with a new question about the Trinity. What does it mean that we have one God but three persons? And what does that even mean? And what does it look like? So just, you can be confident this is it on sin. We'll have more exciting things next week. But we're going to be addressing this question, and there's a few ways we can address the question. The first we have to highlight, we will always address things here through Scripture. So we're not going to say, what does culture consider sin? What do some people fight over as there isn't sin? We're saying, what does the Bible tell us about it? But then as we ask the question, why are we even asking it? Am I asking what sin is because I want to know if I can do this thing that some people say is the moral gray area or not? Or am I asking it so I have the moral high ground over my friend or neighbor who struggles with it? Or am I asking it because I want to see how close I can get to that line before I have to feel any guilt? Well, rather than create a list of all of these things that are or not sin, rather than give you a list of what words can I and can I not say, how far can I or can I not go with my significant other? How much does a thing have to cost before it's technically stealing? Instead of looking at that, we're going to say, what is the heart behind these things? And how can we be a people who have the heart of Christ and not a heart of the world? And if you're oh man, I really wanted that list of sins and list of words and list of behaviors, who knows, maybe I can put something together for you, but you should probably talk to God about it more so than me. But my general rule of thumb is don't try to find liberty, try to pursue Christ. And so we're going to enter today with that goal and mindset of how can we let God transform our hearts so that we can become a people who aren't always fighting sin, but rather we're chasing Him. This is a huge thing. So let me pray again that God can prepare our hearts as we address His word today. God, I want to thank you for giving us your word. And as we've seen these last few weeks, the way it can challenge us. But God, through that challenge and those rebukes and those corrections, Lord, can you also help us be a people who desire to chase hard after you? God, I pray that you prepare our hearts and our minds as we approach your word. I pray, God, that you just let us be a people fully devoted. God, I just echo what Chris was saying. I pray for Barry and others in our church suffering with illnesses and hardships and multiple family members lost this last week, God. But then also we thank you on the flip side, just talking to Jason this morning, Lord, his new nephew, Luca. Just thank you, God, for giving us joy in the midst of sorrow. Pray, God, that you help us gather in your presence today. Amen. In the late 1960s, Ford Motor Company saw a need in the market. They needed a low-cost vehicle that was lightweight and would have mass market appeal. But they also wanted to get to the market fast. So in 1971, they released a new car. They had 3 models of this car. and it was one of the cheapest cars on the market at the time. You could buy this beauty for $1,850. Before you get too excited at a car under $2,000, realize in modern money, that's still over $15,000. But it was one of the lightest cars on the market. It was one of the cheapest cars on the market. Over the 10 years they sold over 3 million units. And you might wonder, like, if it did so well, why did it stop? Whatever happened to it? Well, it had one kind of big, explosive, you could say, problem. The Ford Pinto here, if it got rear-ended, well, I did say it was kind of explosive. But how can that be street legal? How could they sell millions of cars that if bumped in the back, erupts in flames? Like, you'd think there'd be laws and like safety standards. And you're like, well, maybe it was the 70s. Maybe things were different back then. But in reality, this car would still be street legal today. They checked every box. They followed every standard. The car did not do anything wrong. But for the sake of the price point, for the sake of getting it developed quickly, they kind of had to get as close to some of those laws as you can. Like, what's the thinnest material we can use? What's the least air gaps we can have? And when you keep flirting with all of those lines too often, these small gaps add up to explosive consequences. The Ford Pinto has become kind of a laughingstock, a joke about safety in cars in early Americana. As I was researching this week, I learned it wasn't really any more dangerous than any other similarly sized coupe on the market at the time. Ford just has a lot worse PR people, apparently. Almost all the other cars in the same category with the similar fuel tank placement have the exact same problem. But as Christians, we often play the role of the Ford engineers, don't we? We're like, well, the Bible tells me no unwholesome speech should come out of my mouth, so instead of saying this word, I'm going to change the I to a U and say this word. It's not the swear word, it's a new one. Or, I know I shouldn't gossip about people, so I'm just going to share prayer requests about them. We do the exact same thing. Like, we're making a Pinto of our own life. We're flirting with this idea of, it can't really get that bad. But then as we flirt with those lines more and more, and we're like, I can have 3 beers before I'm drunk, so I'm going to go to this party and it'll be fine. And like 8 beers later, I'm like vomiting on some stranger's couch. We have to ask ourselves, like, why do we tend to do this so often? Why do we look for opportunities to kind of merge with the main line of society while ignoring what the Bible may be telling us what to do? And so today, as we kind of address this question of what is sin, or what can and can't, or what should or shouldn't I do, we're going to start by defining sin, not so we can get as close to it as possible, but so that we know what to stay away from. We define it not so that I can say, hey, I'm not guilty yet because I'm still here, but rather we define it so we can say, I know not even to head that direction. I know that I shouldn't go left because the danger slope, it's icy, it's dangerous. I shouldn't even risk walking on that ground. But for long, the church has struggled with this question because we fall on one of two ends. We either fall on the side of license and we claim grace and we're like, God will forgive me, so why not do this thing today and ask for forgiveness tomorrow? We misquote God is love. We looked at that last week, and like, you can't say God is love without saying God has wrath against sin. It's the same passage. But we forget that, and we claim grace, and we look no different from the sinful world that we find ourselves in. On the other side, this is the sin I grew up in the 90s, is we claim legalism. We say, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid sin. I'm not even going to listen to that secular radio station because I don't want people to hear what's in my car and think I am a terrible sinner. And not only does that make us look so different from the world that our evangelistic appeal suffers. But for me personally, I replaced the sin of whatever I'm avoiding with the sin of pride. I now have this moral self-righteous, I am so better than all of my classmates because they're listening to Rock 108, those fools. How dare they? And then I go home and listen to equally terrible music online or whatever. But it's so easy for us to fall on one of these two ends. We have the sin of license, or I would argue the sin of legalism. And the sin of legalism is the sin of the Pharisees. That's what Jesus called out time and time again in his ministry. The sin of license would have been the sin of Rome, but spawned the book of Romans and Corinthians. So as we look at defining sin, we have to find how can we rightly address it without falling into either of these other sins in our attempt not to sin. Let's begin looking at Romans 6 quick, and then we'll be jumping to 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 today. So if you want to open to 1 Corinthians 8, we'll be there in a little bit, but we're going to start first in Romans 6. This was kind of our core verse last week, starting in verse 1. Should we continue in sin so grace may multiply? Absolutely not. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Don't use that same flawed logic that the Bible itself rebukes. Don't think God will forgive me later, so I'm just going to sin now. But then later in just earlier in Romans 5, he wrote, the law came to multiply the trespass, and where sin multiplied, grace multiplied even more. So at the same time, if we focus on the law, that element of legalism, that's just going to multiply our trespasses. Because if I feel immense guilt and shame for doing something that's not a sin, as we'll see in some of today's passages, that could become sin for me. Because while the action I'm doing might not be sinful, the heart and the mind I'm cultivating in my attempt to avoid or to flirt with is a heart and attitude of sin. So often we can find it's the attitude that matters almost more so than the action. So when we use legalism as our guide, we sin by trying to avoid sin, and we use license as our guide, we just sin because we don't bother avoiding it. So how can we find that safe middle ground? If only at some point someone in the Bible would have been like, hey, here are some sins we face daily. What should we do about it? It would have been so helpful if that would have just happened. And fortunately, for us, it did. In Corinthians 8 and 10, I would love to sometime do a deep dive in Corinthians. The first time I was preaching while I was in my residency, that's the series we were in, and they gave me the worst chapters of Corinthians because no one else wanted to preach on them. But it would be an amazing series, and just these sections we'll cover today, I could spend an entire summer in. So I'm going to try to summarize 8 sermons into half of a sermon today. We'll see how well that works. But at this point in time, Corinth was an economic powerhouse of Rome. If you wanted to avoid long, hazardous shipping lanes, you had to go through a canal controlled by the city of Corinth. And being such a wealthy, pivotal economic center point, it became a cultural center point as well. All the nations who are using the canal wanted people there to have a say in the city, which led to temples to every god imaginable in the known world. And as the church was spreading, you get people who used to worship Apollo, who used to worship Venus, who used to worship Mars, now coming to know Christ, but not knowing, what do I do with that old life? And it's even harder when you have to walk by the temple of Venus on your way to worship Jesus. And one of the problems they had at the time is, especially to the Roman gods of Neptune and Venus, they would sacrifice bulls and lambs in their worship, but then to help fund their ministry, which again, it's not a ministry when it's to a false god, but to help fund it, they would then sell the meat from those sacrifices. But they would often sell it at lower than market price. And so the church in Corinth is like, so we have this meat that was sacrificed to an idol, but we're being more financially wise if we buy that meat. So can we? Like, Paul, I'm a Christian. Can I eat meat that was sacrificed to an idol? If I was a crueler pastor, I would have made you guys fill out a little survey with that question on it so we could highlight how divided our own church probably is over this issue. But if we want to make it easier, maybe we replace eating meat to an idol to maybe even a more mundane cultural practice like, I don't know, celebrating Halloween. Talking about the Easter Bunny? Talking about Santa? Did anyone get mad at me yet? I don't know. What can Christians do around, in this case, literally evil practices in the nation around them? So let's see how Paul begins to answer this question starting in verse 4. About eating food sacrificed to idols. Then we know an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father. All things are from him, and we exist for him, and there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. All things are through him, and we exist through him. However, not everyone has this knowledge. Some have been so used to idolatry up until now, they eat food sacrificed to the idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us closer to God. We are not worse off if we don't eat, and we are not better off if we do eat. Paul can be kind of hard to understand at times. He can kind of talk in circles, and he quotes people, and you're like, wait, are you quoting a good guy right now, or are you quoting a bad guy right now? So trying to dive in and understand what he's saying is he's like, hey, you can eat that food. Unless you don't think you can eat that food. Because if your conscience is weak and eating that food makes you think you're worshiping Neptune or Venus, then don't eat the food. But if you have the knowledge that Neptune and Venus are nothing, and you know you're just eating cheap meat, then go ahead and eat the meat. It becomes a heart and understanding issue. And so it'd be really easy to draw a strong theological viewpoint off of those verses alone. But Paul, being Paul, decides he needs to keep going. So he continues now in verse 9. But be careful that this right of yours in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, won't his weak conscience be encouraged to eat food offered to idols? So the weak person, the brother or sister for whom Christ died, is ruined by your knowledge. Now when you sin like this against brothers and sisters and wound the weak conscience, you are sinning against Christ. So if you know that this meat is nothing, eat the meat. If you struggle with that knowledge, don't eat the meat. If you know it's nothing, but someone doesn't know that, and you eating it would impact them, don't eat. Paul, what is going on? I needed help to try to wrap my mind around this. So being a visual-ish person I am, I made a chart. So you either eat or you do not eat. You either know it is not sin or you think it is sin. If I eat it and I know it's not sin, I'm in the good. I'm fine. If I know it is not sin and I choose not to eat it, I'm still good. But if I think it's a sin and I eat it, it is bad. It becomes a sin. If I think it's sin so I don't eat it, good. I'm not eating what I think it is wrong to eat. But if I know it is sin, and I lead one of these people to do something that to them would be wrong, I am now guilty not of that sin, but of sinning against them, and he says, sinning against Christ. So there's almost a danger to having some of this understanding that my actions now carry weight to people around me. I have to be cautious how what I do impacts other people. It is very easy for us to kind of look at something like this and say, okay, well, I'm just going to force my knowledge in on everyone else. This doesn't become a problem if everyone knows this, right? So my entire life mission now is going to be telling people to eat this meat. Or I could tell them about Jesus and probably have a bit more of an impact there. But so often in our license to do what we know is okay, we turn that license into our only message, and then our message loses the weight of the truth and salvation that it originally provided. And so Paul finishes in verse 13. Therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never again eat meat, so that I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. Now, to help you understand how wild this claim is, Paul grew up as a strong Israelite Jewish man, meaning he probably never tasted bacon until he became a Christian. And then someday he had the best experience of his life. And now he's saying, I will never eat bacon again if me eating bacon would lead someone else to sin. I would be like, I won't eat bacon in public. Right? That's a strong statement. But he's saying that Paul cares more about the fellow Christian than about his own joy, about his own entertainment, about his own pleasure. And he takes almost the entire next chapter of Corinthians, highlighting his rights and privileges and how he will sacrifice each and every one of those for the sake of the gospel message. He's like, I have the right to this, but I don't care. I have the right to that, and I don't care. I can do this, but I'm not going to do it if it means advancing the gospel to the people around me. We could jump to chapter 10. We could jump to Romans 14. We can see time and time again the same question of can we eat this sacrificed meat brought up. Apparently, it was quite the problem in ancient Rome, especially for the church. But before we jump somewhere else, let's jump to chapter 10 and just see how he returns to this idea. He goes on his rant about sacrificing freedom, and he talks about idolatry and the way idolatry can just ruin our lives. And I mean, that would be like a whole series for another year. But instead, he says some things that are almost even harder to hear than the dangers of idolatry. And he talks about this idea that you can do it, but what does it look like? And for 2,000 years since this next thing we're about to read, pastors have kind of struggled with it. So let's see what he says here and try to understand why it's so hard. 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 23. Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything builds up. No one is to seek his own good, but the good of the other person. Now, Koine Greek, the language that Paul was writing in, does not use quotation marks. They actually don't really use any punctuation. It is a nightmare to try to read Koine Greek. And so we read what he wrote, we read the other writings of the day to understand that his quote, everything is permissible, that's not Paul's argument, that's the Church of Corinth's argument. The people practicing license, the people saying, I'll sin now and ask forgiveness later, they're saying, but everything's permissible, right? And he's like, even if that's the case, that doesn't mean it's beneficial. Like, well, everything's permissible. But even if that's the case, not everything builds up. And so you, Church of Corinth, you, Church of Rome, you, Church in Fayette, Iowa, Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other person. Don't embrace all your rights because you have the right, but rather say, what builds up the people and the church? Now, sometimes building up a person means tearing them down. Sometimes building up a church means attacking the culture that's hurting the church. So Paul is not here giving us a blank check to accept all the sins of the world around us. He's not saying, hey, just tell your Venus-worshiping neighbor to keep sacrificing in the temple of Venus. That would go against most of Paul's other writing. Paul still wants everyone to come to that saving knowledge of Christ and leave their sins behind them. He wants their neighbors to quit worshiping Neptune, to quit worshiping Venus, to quit worshiping Mars. Yes, like all of our planets are named after Roman gods. I don't know why. But as he's making this statement, he's reminding them that our sin is the reason that Christ had to die. And so every time you sin, if you're like, oh, I'm playing a role in the necessity of Christ's death, hopefully that helps you desire that sin less and less. But that ends, no one is to seek his own good, but the good of others. That is the line that so many pastors and churches struggle with because we don't know how to delineate acceptance and benefit. Because quite often, acceptance is the least good you can do. If a person is taking substances, be it alcohol or drugs, and it's going to lead them to an early grave, the worst thing you can do is just tell them to keep going. If a person is just like, I'm going to become an Aryan in the sense of I just live on air. I don't eat anymore. I just breathe air and live in the sunlight. Like, give the dude a sandwich because he's going to die. Don't accept what he says is reasonable because it's not. And yes, that's a literal theology that some people have. But how can we do this well? I'm cutting out a part of chapter 10 because it would take me like an entire sermon to explain it, but I don't want you to think I'm cutting it out because it's weird, so I'll go ahead and summarize it for you. He's like, don't you know that what they're sacrificing to is demonic? And so how can you participate with something that's demonic and participate with Christ? And so people will use that argument to say, oh, so we shouldn't eat that meat because now that meat is demonically sacrificed meat. Again, like to fully dive into what Paul is saying here, it would take a lot of time. So instead, let me skip all of that and jump to his conclusion, starting in verse 31. So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone in everything, not seeking my own benefit, to the benefit of many, so that they may be saved. I skipped verse 25. We were supposed to jump to verse 25. Verse 25, eat everything that is sold in the meat market without raising questions for the sake of conscience. Okay, so he just said, don't you know that sacrifice to idols? How can you participate in idols and participate in the cross? And then he says, eat whatever's in the market. So we can quit using that argument because verse 25 defeats that argument. We then go from verse 25 to whatever you do for the glory of God. So whether you're eating this meat altered to Neptune or whether you're saying, I won't eat that meat, do that for God's glory, not because you really like bacon. Make your decision not on what you like, but on what God expects. And do these things not for your benefit, but for the benefit of others. And he adds what that benefit is. The benefit of others is so they may be saved. That's the only benefit that ultimately matters. And if by giving them a license to keep sinning is your view of acceptance, then that acceptance is robbing them of the greatest benefit of being saved. Because to be saved, we have to confess that sin. And if we as the church aren't calling sin sin, why would they confess it? So let's pick up some speed. We're 2 blanks down and we got 3 to go. So I tried to summarize this idea by saying, if uncertain, don't test something, just avoid it. If you don't know if this is a sin or not, don't say, hey, I'll try it and see what happens. Just avoid it. I am not an electrician. Some of you here are. So correct me if I'm wrong. But if I have like 500 volts going through a wire and I don't know if that's live or not, I probably shouldn't just grab it. I could be wrong. Maybe that's the right way to test voltage. But last I checked, that's a really good way to die. So if you don't know if something is a sin, don't grab a wire to see if it's live. Grab like a tool to test the wire, like the Bible. And see, how could the Bible help us understand those actions, those ideas? And there's a great passage that I love to look at for some of these things, and how really small sins can balloon to really big problems. And it's a passage that a lot of people probably wouldn't jump to. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and it's from Numbers. I was telling my wife about this week, and she's like, not many people's favorite passages come from Numbers. But in Numbers chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, that's the brother and sister of Moses, Miriam and Aaron start to complain. This is Numbers 12, starting in verse 1. Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because of the Cushite woman he married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, does the Lord speak only through Moses? Does he not also speak through us? And the Lord heard it. Now, their sin here is part jealousy, part gossip, potentially a little hint of racism against the Cushites. And they're complaining to one another. It's a small sin. Like, it's just the two of them. They're not talking in a crowd. But the Lord heard it. The Lord hears what we're saying to one another in private. I didn't throw why this is my favorite part on the screen, but if you have your own Bibles and you want to read Numbers 12 later on, the next line says, and Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. Do you know who wrote Numbers? Moses. So here we got the most humble man on the face of the earth, making sure we know biblically he is the most humble man on the face of the earth. Some theologians argue that was added by a future scribe. But regardless, it makes me laugh every time I read it. So if you need a good laugh, read Romans 12:3 sometime. But they had this small sin just between the two of them. But that small sin of gossip had a heart of questioning God. And a heart that was doubting God's plan and God's method. And so God's like, okay, that's great. Miriam, you can have leprosy now. And then Moses, being the most humble man on the face of the earth, he's like, God, I feel bad. Can you heal her? And so God says, sure. He gives her a week of leprosy, then he heals her. But I love that idea, how we have these small private sins. And the small private sin balloons to leprosy and just this terrible thing, because it could have taken a root. And that questioning of God by the brother and sister of the dude leaving the nation to freedom could lead to so many more problems, couldn't it? But how many of our sins start with that same small question? Even the original sin in the garden started with that same question. Jumping back to the church of Corinth, if we could say Paul's first letter didn't finish the job, apparently they struggled. He had to write 2 Corinthians. He references another letter, so apparently he wrote 3 Corinthians, I guess, at some point. But in 2 Corinthians 10, Paul is warning them about spiritual warfare, this battle that we have against sin and temptation. And he tells them, 2 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 4, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. We demolish arguments and every proud thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. And I love this idea. He talks about after this, we need to be eagerly ready to punish those lies. But to do that, we first have to capture them. take captive every thought to obey Christ. If the moment Aaron and Miriam had that thought of like, why does Moses get all this credit? Like, doesn't God speak through us too? Aaron, weren't you the one talking to Pharaoh? He was Moses' mouthpiece. If they would have stopped and gone, wait, who are we to question God? They probably wouldn't have had this suffering of leprosy. But how often do we see a temptation and go, does God really care if I do that? Will God really be upset if random dude in Iowa just embezzles a little bit? It's just tax evasion. It's just one night of a drunken rampage. I'm just going to do this thing with my girlfriend once, and then we won't do it again. We so easily justify sin, and we begin by either questioning God's judgment or questioning God's laws. We don't think he will punish sin, or we don't think he calls the thing I want to do sin. We need to kill the thought before it can take root. We need to take the thought captive and remove it before it can do damage. I love what Paul tells his disciple Timothy. As we're doing this, we should focus on righteousness rather than on sin. And writing to Timothy, the young leader of a church in Ephesus, Paul tells him in 1 Timothy 6:11, "But you, man of God, flee from these things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." He had just warned him about people who, in the end of verse 10, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And so he's saying, don't wander away like they did. Flee from those things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. When we approach Christ, are we saying, all right, God, give me a list of things to avoid? Or are we saying, God, give me a way to live? Because if we follow the way God calls us to live, we don't have to worry about all that avoidance, because by living in the lane God calls us to, those things will be outside the blinders. We need to focus on God first. If I'm seeking to honor God with my life, I will pause and think before I tell that joke maybe I shouldn't think. I will pause and think about my words before I say those words. I will pause and think before I choose whether or not to go to this movie or go to that thing or go to this party. If I'm pursuing Christ first, all my decisions will start with, how will this help me become more like Christ? How will this help me become a better ambassador for God and not the hypocrites that too often we are? And that's why so many people call those of us in the church hypocritical. It's because we are. It's because we're not taking our thoughts captive. Or we're on the side of legalism and we're calling everything sin. We need to live the life as the Bible calls us to live. You, man of God, flee from these things, this list of sin. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. So big sins, avoid them. Small sins, avoid them. Sins that you do, avoid them. Sins you do by not doing something, avoid them. I was talking to a guy who was at a conference for worship leaders. So it's just like a massive work convention for people whose job is to worship. I think that would be kind of fun. And they had a group of guys, they were standing around talking, they were all getting really excited, and in one of the guys' excitement, I don't know what he said, but apparently like multiple like words that we would consider swear words came out, and like silence. And instantly he's like, I'm sorry, I've only been a Christian for like 2 years, and I've got 35 years of junk language I'm trying to grow out of. So I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't say that. Please forgive me. How do you think I could word that in the future? He took what he realized at once was wrong, he confessed, and then he asked them to speak truth into his life. That's amazing. Like, I probably would have turned beet red and just, like, excused myself and walked away. But the way he's like, and I love what the guy telling me the story mentioned later on, he's like, if the same heart said, like, you're hammering and you hit your thumb and you go, ouch, your heart isn't any different when you say a different word. So why is it that we can be so defensive of what words we can or can't say when really we need to become a people who don't want to say things that could be detrimental in the first place? Gossip can do far more damage than good or bad words. But the church doesn't talk too much about that. We just call it a prayer circle. So how can we be a people who, like this worship leader, recognize and confess our sin and then try to overcome our sin? This is just an easy example because there's a bunch of worship leaders, so they're doing stuff right anyways. But Paul expands on some of these things, and the verse that we would always look to is Ephesians 4, starting in verse 29. Ephesians 4:29. No foul language should come from your mouth, but only what is good for building up someone in need, so that it gives grace to those who hear. Then jumping to verse 31. Let all bitterness, anger, wrath, shouting, and slander be removed from you, along with all malice. You'll note in this list of things, what matters a lot more so was the heart and the attitude behind the language. Like the foul language was the bitter language, the angry language, the wrathful language, the shouted language, the slander language, the language with malice. He doesn't go into detail. Rather, he's like, focus on those things. And if you overcome anger, malice, wrath, slander, you'll probably use different words. Because if I'm happy instead of angry, I'm probably using happier language, aren't I? So the question we should focus on is, what is my heart and attitude? That doesn't mean we don't try to fix the symptoms, does it? Like when I have a cold, I still take cough medicine. I don't say, oh, the cough's just a symptom. I throw in a cough drop so that I don't cough my face off. So still focus on the symptom, but focus even more so on the heart. In Romans 12, starting in verse 1, we see this great call before us. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may discern what is good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. We need to live sacrificially. We need to live in a way that my old mindset is being killed off. We need to live in a way that I'm being transformed more and more into Christ. The thing is, with a sacrifice, part of a sacrifice involves killing it. But a living sacrifice means you are enduring that sacrificial pain nonstop, the pain of killing the old you. The pain of saying, I'm not going to do what I did. I'm not going to do what I want to do. And two of my friends do a great job illustrating this. When I was in college, me and my friends were the midnight release kind of people. I don't know if any of you still are or were that group, but we're like, we don't want spoilers, so we will go to the first showing of a movie that we want to see, or maybe even a movie we don't care much about, but we need to know it for the sake of culture. And so we saw a lot of really stupid movies because we thought we had to. And we went to them before there were good reviews because we had to go when the people who would write those reviews were going. And one day there was a movie that we were all really excited about, and we were getting ready, we were looking at tickets, and then a friend of ours was like, hey, I'm throwing a birthday party. It's going to be a big game night. Play board games all night. It's going to be great. Will you guys come? And I'm a game guy, so I'm like, yes, I'm there. I'll catch the movie the next day. Surely it can't be spoiled in 18 hours. But a few of my friends are like, no, we got some other friends. We're going to meet them at the movie anyways, but we'll come to the first half of the birthday party and then we'll leave. So we're in the middle of a game. Two of the guys take off to go to this movie, and like 45 minutes later, they're back. I'm like, dude, what? Were you not able to get tickets, or like what's going on? And like, well, we got to the theater and we were in line, and like this was before you bought all your tickets early and online, so if you were too young to understand this era of life. And like we're in line, we know we're close enough to get tickets, but then someone pulls up a review of just like a basic review. There were no spoilers, and we learned that there's like a ton of language in this movie. And there's like an 8-minute like brothel scene. And we don't want to expose ourselves to that. So in front of their friends and classmates, they're like, I'm sorry guys, we don't want to expose ourselves to that kind of junk, so we're taking off. Now granted, they did eventually rent the movie, and they were able to like chapter skip ahead of some of that. And they admit the story was great, and that scene was completely unnecessary. But they were explaining, like, at the time, they were the laughingstock. All of their friends teased them for the rest of the semester. But being in the circle of those same friends, when those two guys were gone, they were like, man, I do not have the guts to have done that. Those guys are more manly than the rest of us here, because they were willing to embarrass themselves publicly for the sake of their virtue. Now, they disagreed with those virtues, but they were kind of jealous that they had the ability to do that, and that's why they made fun of them. In the same way, how can we live sacrificially, saying, I don't want to expose myself to these things? And we have different things that we wrestle with. Like, I could listen to certain words and have no temptation to use them. But one of these two guys, like, he repeats everything before his brain has time to process what words just came out of his mouth. And so he's like, I can't expose myself to that because I know what will come out. He's worried about what comes out, not what comes in. The other guy, he admits, like, I struggled with a pornography addiction for years, and so I can't see a movie with that kind of a scene and have my mind immediately snap back to those sins and temptations. Other people could watch that same movie and have no temptation whatsoever. So we need to know what tempts us and how can we flee from sin. Now, I did not at all give great answers, did I? Like, what specific things can and can't I do? I did not say, here's a list of words you can or cannot say. Here are a list of actions you should or shouldn't pursue. And just for the people who will be upset because I didn't say anything, I'll give you guys two passages. We won't dive into them because we dove into them last week. And so if you want to revisit them, you can watch last week's sermon. The first is 1 Corinthians 6, starting in verse 9. Don't you know the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral people, no idolaters, no idolaters, no males who have sex with males, no thieves, no greedy people, no drunkards, no verbally abusive people, no swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. But then remember, he ends with, and some of you used to be like this, but you are no longer. We also looked at Proverbs 6, starting in verse 16. The Lord hates 6 things. 7 are detestable to him. We probably shouldn't do things the Lord detests, should we? Haughty or arrogant eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that plots wicked schemes, feet eager to run to evil, a lying witness who gives false testimony, and one who stirs up trouble among brothers. So if you want a list of things not to do, like you can start by starting with those. You can practice those, but ultimately we need to identify what are the things that struggle or wrestle with our soul. But then how can we follow the command that Paul gave Timothy? Flee from these things. Flee from the things in Proverbs 6 and 1 Corinthians 6. Flee from those things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. May we demolish arguments and proud things raised against the knowledge of God. Can we take thoughts captive to obey Christ? Can we present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God? May we not be conformed to the age, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. I seriously, Thursday, was debating making this a 4-week series and jumping next week into, what are sins of omission versus sins of commission? What are sins of surprise versus sins of a planned will? What are, besetting sins and just bad habits? And a lot of you are like, I've never heard half of those words before. And maybe that's why I chose not to do it. But I've mentioned before, we send out a weekly email. If you want to get on that email list, you can email the church. You can talk to me or some other people. And my pastoral letter this week will probably address some of those things. So a way to kind of put a nail in this series is saying, hey, here's the stuff I didn't get to talk about. And here's a brief summary, which makes me sad because there was an amazing article that came out this week called Mater Populi Fidelis. That's Latin for Mother of the Faithful People. I'm a Protestant, but this came from the Vatican, and it's amazing. Essentially, they're here is how we should and shouldn't think of Mary. And now I disagree with them on 15%. But that means we have 85% in common, and they had some really good stuff, and I really wanted to write about that, but I won't get to. So maybe another letter will involve writing fun stuff like that. But again, if you want an email kind of diving in and putting a final nail in the coffin that is this mini-series within a series, let us know, and I can get you on that email list. Next week, we'll ask who or what is the Trinity? How can we have one God in 3 persons? Just something light that's divided the church for 2,000 years, nothing major. But let me pray for us, and then we can be dismissed. God, I want to thank you. Thank you, God, for giving us your word, whether it be challenging or equipping, whether it be agreeing or disagreeing with us. But God, may you continually change us into a people that are pursuing you and fleeing sin. God, each and every one of us has different sins and temptations. Some are the same, some are different. But God, as you mentioned in Corinthians, none are unique. None are special, and all of them, you give us a way of escape. I pray, God, help us seek that escape. I pray, God, as we shift next week to some hopefully more lighthearted scriptures, but equally challenging, help us not quit thinking about righteousness. Help us embrace those words of 1 Timothy, God. May we flee sin and pursue. I pray, God, that you can use each and every one of us as a transforming agent for the cultures that we find ourselves in, bringing people closer and closer to you, God, for your name and for your kingdom and for your will.